The war in Ukraine is the most significant geopolitical event of the 21st century. It marks a turning point in international relations, with far-reaching consequences for the global order. This conflict is not merely a regional dispute, it is a clash of ideologies, a struggle for power, and a harbinger of a more turbulent future. The world is watching as the events unfold, and the outcome will shape the geopolitical landscape for generations to come. At the heart of the conflict lies Ukraine, a nation caught between Russia and the West. For centuries, Ukraine has been a bridge between East and West, a crossroads of cultures and a battleground for empires. Its fertile lands and strategic location have made it a coveted prize, but also a source of conflict. The current war is a tragic chapter in Ukraine's long and tumultuous history, but it is also a defining moment for the international community. The war in Ukraine has shattered the illusion of peace that followed the Cold War. It has exposed the fragility of the rules-based international order and the limits of diplomacy. The conflict has also highlighted the dangers of authoritarianism, nationalism, and militarism. As the world grapples with the consequences of this war, it is essential to understand its origins, its impact, and its implications for the future. This is not just a war about territory or resources, it is a war about values and principles. It is a war about democracy versus autocracy, about freedom versus oppression, about the right of nations to determine their own destiny. The outcome of this war will have profound implications not only for Ukraine and Russia, but for the entire world. To understand the roots of the current conflict, we must look back to the tumultuous history of the 20th century. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 left a void in Eastern Europe, and Ukraine, with its long history of ties to Russia, became a focal point of geopolitical tensions. The seeds of the current conflict were sown in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse, as Russia struggled to come to terms with its diminished status, and Ukraine sought to assert its independence. In 2014, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, a Ukrainian territory with a majority Russian population. This annexation was widely condemned by the international community as a violation of international law. However, Russia's actions in Crimea were a harbinger of things to come, a sign that Moscow was willing to use military force to achieve its geopolitical objectives. Following the annexation of Crimea, Russia-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine launched an armed insurgency against the Ukrainian government. This conflict, which became known as the War in Donbas, simmered for 8 years, claiming the lives of thousands of people. The war in Donbas was a frozen conflict, a festering wound in the heart of Europe that would eventually erupt into a full-scale war. Despite international efforts to broker a peace agreement, the conflict in Donbas continued, fueled by Russian support for the separatists and Ukrainian determination to resist what it saw as Russian aggression. The Minsk agreements, signed in 2014 and 2015, were intended to bring an end to the fighting, but they ultimately failed to address the underlying issues that had led to the conflict. The West, led by the United States and its NATO allies, responded to Russia's actions with a combination of condemnation, sanctions, and military support for Ukraine. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a military alliance formed in 1949 to counter the Soviet Union. After the Cold War, NATO expanded eastward, admitting many former Soviet satellite states into its ranks. Russia viewed NATO expansion as a threat to its security interests, and it repeatedly warned the West against admitting Ukraine into the alliance. However, NATO maintained that it was a defensive alliance and that its eastward expansion was not directed against Russia. NATO's eastward expansion was a source of contention between Russia and the West, and it contributed to the growing mistrust between the two sides. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, NATO invoked Article 4 of its founding treaty, which states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. This invocation triggered consultations among NATO members and led to the deployment of additional troops to Eastern Europe to deter further Russian aggression. The war in Ukraine has had a profound impact on NATO, revitalizing the alliance and strengthening its resolve. The conflict has demonstrated the importance of collective defense and the need for a strong transatlantic partnership. NATO has emerged from the crisis stronger and more united than ever before, but it faces new challenges in a more dangerous and unpredictable world. Section 4, Russia's pivot east, seeking new partnerships. In response to Western sanctions and isolation, Russia has deepened its ties with China and other non-Western powers. This shift towards the east is a significant development in global geopolitics, with the potential to reshape the global balance of power. Russia and China, both facing increasing pressure from the West, have found common ground in their shared opposition to what they see as a US-led world order. China has emerged as Russia's most important partner, providing economic and diplomatic support. The two countries have strengthened their economic ties, with China becoming a major importer of Russian energy. They have also conducted joint military exercises and coordinated their foreign policy positions on key international issues. Russia has also sought to strengthen its ties with other countries in the global south, including India, Brazil, and South Africa. These countries, many of which were part of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, have refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine and have maintained a neutral stance on the conflict. The war in Ukraine has accelerated Russia's pivot towards the east, but it remains to be seen how far this shift will go. Russia's long-term strategic goals are still unclear, and its relations with China are complex and multifaceted. Section 5. Global energy upheaval. A new landscape emerges. The war in Ukraine has sent shockwaves through global energy markets, disrupting supply chains and sending prices soaring. Russia is a major energy exporter, particularly of oil and natural gas, and the war has led to a scramble for alternative sources of energy. The conflict has exposed the world's dependence on Russian energy and has accelerated the transition to renewable energy sources. Europe, heavily reliant on Russian gas, has been particularly hard hit by the energy crisis. The European Union has announced plans to reduce its dependence on Russian gas by 2/3 by the end of 2022 and to become independent from Russian fossil fuels by 2030. This ambitious plan will require a massive investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency. The war in Ukraine has also led to a surge in demand for liquefied natural gas, or LNG, as countries seek to reduce their reliance on Russian pipeline gas. The United States has emerged as a major LNG supplier to Europe, helping to offset the loss of Russian gas. The global LNG market is expected to grow significantly in the coming years as countries seek to diversify their energy sources. The energy crisis triggered by the war in Ukraine has highlighted the need for energy security and the importance of diversifying energy sources. It has also accelerated the transition to renewable energy as countries seek to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels and address the climate crisis. Section 6. Hunger in a time of war. Food security under threat. The war in Ukraine has exacerbated a global food crisis, pushing millions of people in developing countries towards hunger. Both Russia and Ukraine are major agricultural producers, and the conflict has disrupted global food supplies, particularly of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil. The war has also led to a surge in fertilizer prices, further threatening food production. The Horn of Africa, already facing a severe drought, is particularly vulnerable to the food crisis. The United Nations has warned that millions of people in the region are at risk of starvation. The war in Ukraine has compounded the food crisis in the Horn of Africa, pushing the region closer to the brink of famine. The war in Ukraine has also had a significant impact on food security in the Middle East and North Africa, a region heavily reliant on wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine. The conflict has led to price hikes and shortages, raising concerns about social unrest. The food crisis in the Middle East and North Africa is a reminder of the interconnectedness of global food systems and the vulnerability of import-dependent regions. The war in Ukraine has exposed the fragility of global food systems and the need for greater resilience in the face of shocks. The conflict has also highlighted the need for international cooperation to address food insecurity and to ensure that everyone has access to affordable, nutritious food. Section 7. A multipolar world takes shape, shifting power dynamics. The war in Ukraine is a watershed moment in international relations, marking the end of the post-Cold War era and the emergence of a new multipolar world order. The conflict has accelerated the shift in global power away from the West and towards the East, with China emerging as a major geopolitical player. The United States remains the world's leading military power, but its influence is waning as other powers, such as China and Russia, assert themselves on the global stage. The rise of China is the most consequential geopolitical development of the 21st century. China's economic and military might is growing, and it is increasingly challenging the United States for global leadership. The war in Ukraine has highlighted China's growing influence, as Beijing has sought to position itself as a mediator in the conflict. The war in Ukraine has also demonstrated the importance of technology in modern warfare. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and the use of drones have all played a significant role in the conflict. The war has highlighted the need for countries to invest in cybersecurity and to develop strategies for countering hybrid warfare. The war in Ukraine is a tragedy for Ukraine, but it is also a wake-up call for the world. The conflict has exposed the dangers of authoritarianism, the limits of diplomacy, and the fragility of the rules-based international order. The war is a reminder that we live in a dangerous and unpredictable world, and that peace and stability cannot be taken for granted.